It is my joy to be with you to worship here today, and I always look forward to my time to be here. I want to say a special thanks to Jeanette and to Steve for their hospitality and hosting me and ushering me around, and also to Teresa and Jack. They also were helpful in getting me settled here this morning, and to John, my friend and brother John, for inviting me to be with you to worship today. When I became a DS, one of my colleagues cautioned me, saying that one of the things that I would find is that I would miss the regular occasion of preaching each week to people I know well and who care for one another and who care about me and I for them. And sure enough, you don't have as many regular opportunities to do that, but I have to say that whenever I've come here to be with you, I have not had that concern. I've always felt like I was among friends here and have always experienced your gift of hospitality and a warm welcome. And one of the ways you know you're at home is when people can play with you. And I have to tell you, I got to tell you this as an example of that. Earlier this morning, I was back in the sound closet or whatever it is back here, where we get wired up for the microphones. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a fairly intimate affair where my arms are out like this and my robe's open, and Jack's reaching behind me and lifting cords up and taping things in my face. And at one point, he actually held the back of my head and pressed the tape, and he said, "Now bite down." So I bit down. There's no need to bite down. He's just giving me a hard time. But I welcome that, because that means I'm at home and among people who care. So thank you. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The Benedictine order of the Catholic Church provides a marvelous part of the Christian tradition. Many of you have seen, perhaps even visited, Mont Saint-Michel, that breathtakingly beautiful granite island off the northwestern coast of France. It's often pictured in the footage of the Tour de France if it's traveling in that region. And that island is topped by a spectacular abbey and church with a towering steeple, and the steeple itself is crowned with a golden statue of the Archangel Michael. Saint-Michel is French for Saint Michael. And that was originally a Benedictine abbey. And when you take a tour of it, you learn how ornate and how colorful the inside of the buildings are, or at least once were. I'll never forget when we were in the dining hall, and they were pointing out the walls and the floors and telling us that when it was actually inhabited and used by the Benedictines, that it would have been very brightly colored, and that instead of taking their meals in silence, there would be joy and laughter and conversation, because that's the way of the Benedictines. We Protestants tend to think of monks as generally austere and simple, overly serious, if not downright joyless. But that's not the Benedictines. Like I said, they lived colorfully and lived a joyful life and a generous life. And understand that's still true of Benedictine monks. Members of the Benedictine order are what we would call proactive in their practice of hospitality toward the stranger. They are taught by the order of St. Benedict to treat each guest, to treat each stranger as if he or she is Jesus Christ himself. And reflecting on a lifetime of living this practice of welcoming the stranger as if that stranger is Jesus, an older monk was sharing with a younger monk about it, and he said, I have finally learned to accept people as they are. Whatever they are in the world, a prostitute or a prime minister, whatever. I see them as all the same. And yet, he confessed, there are those times when I see yet another stranger approaching, coming up the road, and I say, "Oh, Jesus Christ, is it you again?" What the older monk is expressing is what we have come to think of as compassion fatigue. The weariness that comes from the frequent giving of ourselves and doing of good for others who have a genuine need. And in the extreme, it can lead us to detrimental behavior for ourselves. Constant caregivers are cautioned to take time to care for themselves first. And when we catch up with a traveling Jesus in today's gospel lesson, it appears that he's gone 100 miles away from his usual territory, off of his likely course to an unlikely place. And it says that he is alone and looking for a house where he can hide from public view and the growing demands of an increasingly popular public life. We get that need to get away and to be restored body, mind, and soul. And no sooner is he inside the door of a house where he thinks he can be alone, and a woman he is certainly not looking for finds him to ask for help. Now, to this point in the story, there's nothing really that surprises us. We have grown familiar with a popular, on-the-go Jesus who is sought for his help, who often tries to get out of the limelight for a little while for some R&P. That's rest and relaxation and prayer. Frequently, especially in the Gospel of Luke, it says that Jesus retreated to a solitary place to pray, to be alone, to be renewed. So none of that's surprising, but what is surprising to us is Jesus' response to this woman. First, he basically says, no, it's not time for me to help you. And then he not so indirectly refers to her and her daughter as dogs. It's not fair to give the children's food to the dogs before the children have been fed, he says. Now that surprises us. What's going on here? Is Jesus just suffering from an extreme case of compassion fatigue? Or as one observer asked, did this woman catch him with his compassion down? Many have tried to explain the story in many ways because it does stand out among the stories in Mark's gospel as unique. Is Jesus testing her? Could that be what's happening here? Does he sense that she knows the understanding of how and who he is, and he's just testing to see if she really gets it? It could be, but I don't really think that's it. It doesn't line up with all the other indicators in the story or in the rest of the gospel. Another option may be that he really is just flat out refusing her. When he says, let the children be fed first, it sounds like he's saying, no, first things first. The time's not right. Sure, blessings may come in good time to the Gentiles, but for now, my work is on behalf of the children of Israel. He's not saying absolutely not. He's just saying not now. Well, this interpretation seems most in line with the story of Mark, but still it's strange, this lack of compassion on Jesus' part that makes people resist such a reading. And for others, it's just the difficulty of even thinking that if Jesus is really divine, fully human, fully divine, how could it be that someone could persuade him to change his mind about something? That someone could actually win an argument or correct him, as she seems to do. But if you look back into the scriptures, you see footing for that. In the book of Numbers, the 23rd chapter, it says, God is not a human being that he should lie, or a mortal that he should change his mind. We do often think of God as fixed, eternal, unmovable, unchangeable, all-knowing. How does that fit with a Jesus that changes his mind? Well, in Genesis 18, Abraham bargains with God for a whole chapter, pleading with God not to destroy the city of Sodom if he can just find a few people at least that are faithful. And sure enough, God relents and says, okay, I'll give you a chance. Think about that again. In Exodus 32, when God gets angry at the people of Israel for unfaithfully dancing around a golden calf instead of faithfully continuing to make their way toward the promised land, he threatens to undo them. But Moses intervenes and says the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on his people. And Jonah, I love the story of Jonah. If you haven't read it for a while, it's an easy afternoon's reading, just 4 chapters. Great story. And Jonah has been sent by God to warn the people of Nineveh that their destruction is imminent if they don't change their ways. And hearing this message, the Ninevites take it to heart and talk to each other and say, who knows, God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his anger so that we do not perish. And sure enough, they change their ways. And when God sees that they have done that, how they did turn from their evil ways, God did change his mind about the calamity he planned to visit upon them, and he did not do it. And by the way, that really upsets Jonah, who thinks they deserve it. It seems like this God is willing to change his mind if someone has a better idea about the way of grace. That surprises us. And when you think about it, despite her outsider unclean status, it's hard to resist this woman. You see a picture of her here, an old artist's rendering of Jesus there, some other folks standing around, speaking to the woman. There are dogs wandering around between them to remind us of how he has referred to her and her daughter. And there in the background, you see, well, it's kind of hard to see, but you see the open side of her house with her daughter in bed, waiting for relief from her unrelenting suffering. If you've ever felt desperate, truly desperate, the desperation of a mother who cannot do anything to relieve her child's suffering, then you have some sense of her plight. So she's desperate, and yet she's clever and witty. If Jesus wants to talk about bread and children and dogs, then she can pick up that conversation and talk about crumbs and kids and canines in a way that really sharpens her point. And she's theologically astute. She understands that God leans toward grace. She's appropriately humble, and despite the insults, she gently and directly and firmly holds her ground, claims her place. It's hard not to like her. And she seems to trust that Jesus has access to an abundant source of that which she needs. You know, if you rewind Mark's gospel just one chapter, go back one chapter, you hear the story of Jesus, of how Jesus' math turned 5 loaves and 2 fishes into dinner for over 5,000. And when everybody had finished the first seating, the waiters went around and collected 12 baskets of leftovers. And I'm pretty sure the story doesn't indicate what happened with those 12 baskets. But I have an idea. I think that this woman and people like her were seated on the outskirts of that crowd of 5,000, watching as they got their dinner first, waiting patiently without. And then when all was said and done, they were able to help themselves from those 12 baskets and still didn't finish it off. Could she have been thinking to herself, if these are the crumbs left for the dogs after the children have eaten, what else could there be? You know, those who have a hard time with the idea that anybody could win an argument with Jesus and change his mind have suggested that Jesus' response to the woman is really a riddle, that he understood that she knew the truth and that he knew the truth and that he was going to help her. But to really blow open the doors of those who were his opponents, he decided to put that truth in her mouth rather than to continue to speak it himself. Because up to this point in Mark's gospel, we've gotten a pretty good portrait of Jesus as one who is always challenging the religious authorities. He speaks with authority, he acts with resolve, he heals freely, provides extravagantly, gives generously, and otherwise bucks everybody's conventions and expectations. Could that be it? Did this woman manage to soften Jesus' heart and change his mind, or did Jesus welcome this encounter as an opportunity to really open up the doors on his mission and ministry in front of his opponents? And even the biggest outsiders could know that God's love is coming for them to bring them in. You know, I think you can read it either way. But there is something about a Jesus who's willing to be persuaded by an encounter with someone who's very different and who calls out to him in need. Either way, I don't think it matters, because what it means for you and me is this: if you and I follow the way of Jesus, it will change us. If we follow the way of Jesus, it will change our understanding of who we are, and it will change our understanding of what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. It'll change our understanding of God and of our neighbor. You know, I think Lovett Weems made the point best when he said, people more easily live their way into a new way of thinking than think their way into a new way of living. Isn't that true? We live our way into the changes that happen to us a lot more faster than we think our way into that. In this story, I think Mark's saying, put your thinking on hold for a while, put your beliefs on pause, and get out of your usual circumstances and just try living this grace for your neighbor thing and see what it does to you. Lovett Weems is a leader in the United Methodist Church. He's worked with United Methodist pastors across the nation for years in many different settings. And he says that he's found that if two pastors from the Methodist tradition may have grown up in different parts of the country, they may have gone to churches of different types and sizes, they may have been shaped by different theological perspectives, attended different seminaries, read different theologians, subscribed to different journals. They attend different learning experiences and conferences, and on any given week, they preach significantly different sermons, so that they come to represent the sharp polarities within the United Methodist Church. But he says, if they're really true to our Methodist tradition, and if they're really living in the same community, then they will still encounter each other on a regular basis. And it probably won't be in the bookstore, and it probably won't be in the same clergy study group, but they will bump into each other in the hospitals and in the homeless shelter and at the Habitat for Humanity rebuild site and in numerous other places where we go to serve those in need and where we go to bring in those who have been left out. It's the old Methodist understanding taught by Charles Wesley and John Wesley in their hymns and in their preaching, is that we need each other to be made whole. This congregation is part of the East County mission area, and it has delighted my heart in the last couple of years to hear of the ways in which you have, together with other United Methodists in this area, reached out to the community through Impact the World Sundays, and in your efforts to start a new congregation in the Otay Lakes area with the Foundry New Start. This is the impulse and the direction of the Spirit, to lead us out from our familiar places, to encounter God where God's at work out in the world around us. And sure, we bring positive change to the world around us when we do that, but I'm sure there are stories among you about how you have been changed by encountering your neighbors in need. I recently met with members of the South Riverside Mission area, 7 congregations up in the Murrieta, Temecula, San Jacinto area and points in between. They did the same thing not long ago. In June, they had a Change the World Sunday. 250 people organized to go out and do a major work effort at a children for basically a foster home children, a facility for children who were waiting for foster homes. Of those 250, nearly half were not members of any of those churches. They had collaborated with people in the community, and the guy who was telling me about this was one of the work team leaders, and he's a construction worker. He said, that's my job. I'm on construction sites every day. I've been doing it for years, and I've got to say that in all my years of working on a construction team, I have never seen the sort of team spirit and generosity of spirit that I witnessed that day when all of us came together, many of us strangers, to offer ourselves for our neighbors in need. He said that he'd stayed with it to the bitter end, that there was about 5:30 in the afternoon. They'd been at it all day, and there was one piece that he was trying to finalize a little gathering area over a playground area, construction. And he says, doing the final hammering and sanding and leveling, and a little girl, 10 years old, came up. He did not know her, and she said, "Is there something I can do to help?" And he said he didn't want to send her away with nothing, so he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you gather a group of your friends and get some trash bags and go around and just do a cleanup of the site before we leave." Off she ran, and he went back to his work, and he said basically he forgot about it until about 10 minutes later. He looked up, and sure enough, there she was across the way with about a dozen of her friends, and they were all making their way around the whole grounds where they'd been working that day, picking up trash and making sure it was as clean or cleaner than the way they left it and the way they found it. And he said, that changed me. That was one of the most significant things I experienced all day long. I attended another church when they gathered after their day of Impact the World, and a woman said she'd worked up with the team, got up at 5 o'clock that morning. Theirs was the first team to get up and get at it because they made breakfast for some of the day laborers that gather in a parking lot near the church. And they were going to go offer these, mostly men, breakfast. And they were excited about it, happy to make this offering, and had their breakfast already and pulled up in the van. And she said as soon as they got inside the parking lot in the van, she saw some of the men come running toward her, and she said it suddenly came to her. They don't need breakfast. They need a job. And she said, I don't really know what to do with that, but I need to share that with you all because somehow I think God's speaking to us in that. She was changed. Jeff Dietrich is co-director of the Los Angeles Catholic Workers Soup Kitchen on Skid Row. He works there regularly with his wife, serving the poorest of the poor on Skid Row. And last December, he shared some of his experience through an article in the Los Angeles Times, and he told about his encounter with a guy he calls Wheelchair Bob. So Wheelchair Bob fits the predictable description of a guy on Skid Row. He makes his way around in a battered wheelchair. His hair is matted. His shirt and clothes are dirty. He does not smell good. And he says, and on top of that, he's rude and abrasive. He wheels his chair out in the middle of traffic and holds up traffic while he panhandles. He comes into the soup kitchen and seems to expect preferential treatment. He can move so fast in his wheelchair that Jeff suspects maybe he doesn't really need his wheelchair. And in his own words, Jeff says, although I work with Skid Row poor on a daily basis, I secretly reserve the right to like some folks more than others, and Bob is definitely not on my A-list. And yet, just a few weeks before Christmas last year, One day they're in the soup line. Sure enough, Wheelchair Bob shows up, and he holds out a paper cup, a dirty paper cup full of pennies and dimes and other coins, and says, "This is for the prisoners," and sets it down and makes his way to his meal. Well, Jeff is standing there dumbfounded, and his wife has to explain to him that when Bob panhandles, he keeps the paper money for himself, but all the coins he brings as an offering to the soup kitchen in support of their Stamps for Prisoners project, which enables imprisoned men and women to write to their families and loved ones outside the walls of the prison. That encounter changed Jeff, and for the better. And coming just weeks before Christmas, he said it reminded him of his favorite Christmas carol about good King Wenceslas, who went out and called his page to bring me flesh and bring me wine and bring me pine logs hither. And with all his offerings of food and heat, he took them to a beggar who lived neath the mountain right against the forest fence, reminding us all of wealth or rank possessing. Ye who now would bless the poor, shall yourselves find blessing. Don't spend too much time trying to think your way into a new way of living. Get busy living your way into a new way of thinking. When we reach out to our neighbors in need, when we welcome those who've been made to feel left out, we are changed. And I guarantee you, we'll be grateful.
Sometimes I get that overwhelming feeling, so sad, those faces on TV. If I try to make a difference, would it help anyway? But then I stop and to myself I say, so you want to change the world? You say you're gonna start right now. It only takes one voice, so come on now and shout it out. Give a little more. What are you waiting for? Sometimes I feel a little helpless. Seems like I can't do a thing, but anything is possible. Just you wait and see. Good things happen if you just believe. So you want to change the world. You say you're gonna start right now. It only takes one voice, so come on now and shout it out. Give a little more. What are you waiting for? Someday, somehow you're gonna take that step, 'cause time is ticking away. Yeah, right here, right now, before it's too late. Gonna face tomorrow today. So you want to change the world? What are you waiting for? You say you're gonna start right now. What are you waiting for? It only takes one voice, so come on now and shout it out. Give a little more. What are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? You say you're gonna start right now. What are you waiting for? It only takes one voice, so come on now and shout it out. Give a little more. What are you waiting for? What am I waiting for?